What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the Earth and our universe is really his story.
And welcome to Discovering His Story, a production of Youngstown Christian Television. This is a program where we seek to integrate the biblical record with what we know from secular history and see where the two intertwine and what effect they had upon one another. We're in the era of history which we're calling ancient history. And within that period of time of ancient times, we are in the time period where Israel is just going into the Promised Land. And so we're calling this the Canaan period, or the Promised Land period. The last time we were just preparing for Israel to go into the Promised Land, and we were looking at some of the military advantages of the Canaanites. So let's review that quickly. First of all, we see that the Canaanites had experienced armies with advanced weapons. They also had chariots. They were encased in fortified cities, so that the Israelites were seeing walled cities for the first time, walls like they'd never seen before. And the Canaanites were accustomed to forming alliances, of banding together. So these are some of the obstacles which the children of Israel will face as they enter into the Promised Land. Now, before the Israelites are able to get there, though, they have to cross the Jordan River. They have approached the land of Canaan from the east, and the Jordan River lies between them and where they want to go. Now, it's not necessary to find naturalistic explanations for the miracles of Scripture. I'm not in that camp where you got to find some natural way that it could have happened. However, it is possible that Yahweh may have used natural phenomena to accomplish His purposes. And so I at least want to broach that subject here with the crossing of the Jordan River. When the nation of Israel approached the Jordan River, it was the time of spring harvest, when the river was at its peak due to the melting of the snow on Mount Hermon. A damming of the river at the ford near the city of Adam would result in the drying up of the river to its south. So you see there on the map, the city of Adam is much further north from where they are crossing. At the bottom there you see where the Jordan River empties into the Dead Sea. Now, this kind of damming has taken place at various points of the river over the centuries as a result of earthquakes, the last of which occurred in 1927. As the result of a severe quake, the riverbanks caved in, tons of soil crashed down into the riverbed from the low hills that follow the Jordan's winding course. The flow of water was completely stopped for 21 hours. In 1924, the same thing happened. In 1906, the Jordan became so choked up with debris as a result of an earthquake that the riverbed on the lower reaches near Jericho was completely dry for 24 hours. Arab records mention a similar occurrence in AD 1267. And so it's possible that God may have used a natural phenomenon like that in order to block the river from flowing, which then would result in dry land down where the crossing took place. It's also just as possible that God simply stopped the river from flowing right above where they were crossing. Either way, God was in control and God did it. So we have this miracle of the riverbed drying up in order for the Israelites to cross over on dry land with the Ark of the Covenant going first into the water. Now, the campaign that Joshua is going to conduct as he leads the Israelites into the land is going to result in a division of this land. Here we see the boundaries of the promised land. You see the Jordan River there in the center with the nations of Ammon, Moab, and Edom on the east. The promised land really is primarily to the west of the Jordan River, and that's where most of the action is going to take place. And the first place that they're going to go as they conduct this campaign into the center of the land is going to be Jericho. Now, eventually they're going to move north and south, but initially this first contact is in the center of the promised land, Jericho. The mound, or they call it a tell, where they find a city has been built upon one another over centuries and centuries, creating a larger hill than what was there initially. And digging down into these mounds or tells, archaeologists are able to determine a lot about the civilizations that were there over many, many centuries. And the tell of Jericho is surrounded by a great earthen rampart or embankment with a stone retaining wall at its base. If you look carefully on the bottom right-hand side of the picture, you'll see this large retaining wall that is labeled as well. The retaining wall was some 4 to 5 meters or 12 to 15 feet high. On top of that was a mud brick wall, which you can see there, which was 6 feet thick and about 6 to 8 meters or 20 to 26 feet high. So that's a large wall, but that's not all. At the crest of the embankment was a similar mud brick wall whose base was roughly 46 feet above the ground level outside the retaining wall. This is what loomed high above the Israelites as they marched around the city each day for 7 days. Remember, that's what they were told to do. Just march around the city every day, once a day, and God's going to deliver it to you. Humanly speaking, it was impossible for the Israelites to penetrate the impregnable bastion of Jericho. Within the upper wall was an area of approximately 6 acres, while the total area of the upper city and fortification system was 50% larger, or about 9 acres. Based on the archaeologist's rule of thumb of 200 persons per acre, the population of the upper city would have been about 1,200. However, from excavations carried out by a German team in the first decade of the last century, we know that people were also living on the embankment between the upper and lower city walls. In addition, those Canaanites living in surrounding villages would have fled to Jericho for safety, just like in medieval times people fled to the castle. So we can assume that there were several thousand people inside the walls when the Israelites came against the city. The citizens of Jericho were well prepared for a siege. That was normal conduct during war. They had a good spring which provided water, not only for ancient times, but in modern Jericho, which that spring laid within the city walls. At the time of the Israelite attack, the harvest had just been taken in. We find that in Joshua 3:15. So the citizens had an abundant supply of food. They had water. They could outlast a good army. So these Israelites marching around the city didn't really cause them a lot of concern. The fact that they had an abundant supply of food has been borne out by many large jars full of grain found in the Canaanite homes by a British archaeologist and innovator by the name of John Garstang in his excavation in the 1930s, and also by British archaeologist Dame Kathleen Mary Kenyon. With a plentiful food supply and ample water, the inhabitants of Jericho could have held out for perhaps several years. After the 7th trip around the city, on the 7th day, Scripture tells us that the wall fell down flat. The Hebrew here carries the suggestion that it fell beneath itself. Is there evidence for such an event at Jericho? It turns out that there is ample evidence that the mud brick city wall collapsed and was deposited at the base of the stone retaining wall at the time the city met its end. Kenyon's work was the most detailed. On the west side of the tell, at the base of the retaining wall, she found, she says, fallen red bricks piling nearly to the top of the revetment, or the wall. These probably came from the wall on the summit of the bank and or the brickwork above the revetment. In other words, she found a heap of bricks from the fallen city walls. An Italian team excavating at the southern end of the mound in 1997 found exactly the same thing. Professor John Garstang, leader of the expedition in 1936, described what he found. He said, "The space between the two walls is filled with fragments and rubble. There are clear traces of a tremendous fire, compact masses of blackened bricks, cracked stones, charred wood, and ashes. Along the walls, the houses have been burned to the ground and their roofs have crashed down on top of them." There was also found beneath the fallen building material the skeletal remains of at least one person. Now, as you notice on this drawing, you see that the rubble from the upper wall has fallen down toward the outside wall, and the rubble from the outside wall has fallen down over that retaining wall, so that there is not only an opening there, but the fallen bricks provide a way for the Israelites to climb up into through the hole in the wall. The bricks provide a ramp, if you will. Also notice that on the outside wall that there are some buildings there. And according to the Bible record, Rahab's house was incorporated into the fortification system. If the walls fell, how was her house spared? As you recall, the spies had instructed Rahab to bring her family into her house and they would be rescued. When the Israelites stormed the city, Rahab and her family were saved as promised. At the north end of the Tell of Jericho, archaeologists made some astounding discoveries that seem to relate to Rahab. The German excavation of 1907 and 1909 found that on the north, a short stretch of the lower city wall did not fall as everywhere else. A portion of that mud brick wall was still standing to a height of over 8 feet. What is more, there were houses built against the wall. It is quite possible that this is where Rahab's house was. Since the city wall formed the back wall of the houses, the spies could have readily escaped. From this location on the north side of the city, it was only a short distance to the hills of the Judean wilderness where the spies hid for 3 days. Real estate values must have been low here, since the houses were positioned on the embankment between the upper and lower city walls. Not the best place to live in time of war. This area was no doubt the overflow from the upper city and the poor part of town, perhaps even a slum district. After the city walls fell, how did the Israelites surmount the 4 to 5 meter or 12 to 15 foot high retaining wall at the base of the Tell? Well, as I've mentioned, the excavations show that the bricks from the collapsed walls formed a ramp against the retaining wall so that the Israelites could merely climb up over the top. The Bible is very precise in its description of how the Israelites entered the city. In Joshua 6:20 it says, "The people went up into the city, every man straight before him." In essence, straight up and over. The Israelites had to go up, and that is what archaeology has revealed. They had to go from ground level at the base of the Tell to the top of the rampart in order to enter the city. We're also told in Joshua that the Israelites burned the city and everything in it. Once again, the discoveries of archaeology have verified the truth of this record. A portion of the city destroyed by the Israelites was excavated on the east side of the Tell. Wherever the archaeologists reached this level, they found a layer of burned ash and debris about 3 feet thick. Kenyon described the massive devastation as follows, quote, "The destruction was complete. Walls and floors were blackened or reddened by fire, and every room was filled with fallen bricks, timbers, and household utensils. In most rooms, the fallen debris was heavily burnt, but the collapse of the walls of the eastern rooms seems to have taken place before they were affected by the fire." Unquote. Both Garstang and Kenyon found many storage jars full of grain that had been caught in the fiery destruction. This is a unique find in the annals of archaeology. Grain was valuable, not only as a source of food, but also as a commodity which could be bartered. Under normal circumstances, valuables such as grain would have been plundered by the conquerors. Why was the grain left at Jericho? The Bible provides the answer. Joshua commanded the Israelites that the city and all that is in it were to be dedicated to the Lord. Even the houses of Jericho's most ordinary citizens were stocked with storage jars still brimming with grain. There's no other explanation for it than the ban put upon that by Joshua. So the grain left at Jericho and found by archaeologists in modern times gives a graphic testimony to the obedience of the Israelites nearly 3.5 millennia ago. Only Achan disobeyed, remember? Leading to the debacle at Ai described in Joshua 7. Such a large quantity of grain left untouched gives silent testimony to the truth of yet another aspect of the biblical account. A heavily fortified city with an abundant supply of food and water would normally take many months, even years, to subdue. The Bible says that Jericho fell after only 7 days. The jars found in the ruins of Jericho were full, showing that the siege was short, since the people inside the walls consumed very little of the grain. Some astounding things about Jericho, what archaeologists have found there. Well, let's return to the strategy that Joshua has as going into the promised land. The basic strategy is to go into the center, which they are doing at Jericho, and then they're going to go to the north and the south. So this is the conquest of Canaan under Joshua. Follow along with this rendition on the conquest as it is pointed out as to which cities Joshua went to in what order. First of all, we have crossing the Jordan and camping at Gilgal, and then moving to take Jericho and Ai. Next, Joshua made peace with Gibeon. And you have to read that story in the book of Joshua. Then moved through the valley of Ajalon, defeating the 5 Amorite kings. Then from Makkedah, Joshua launched a southern campaign against Lachish, Hebron, Debir, and Gaza. Then up to the north, Joshua moved from Gilgal all the way to Hazor. So that was the overview of Joshua's campaign. We're not going to take a detailed examination of that campaign designed to conquer the land of Canaan, but simply add that the archaeological evidence has been discovered in the southern towns of Lachish, Debir, and Hebron that violent destruction and desolation, in accordance with the biblical account, did indeed occur there. It is quite possible that it is at this time that the aforementioned Amarna letters were written from Canaan to Pharaoh Akhenaten. The report read by the heretic king included this: "Let the king my lord learn that the chief of the Habiru has risen in arms against the lands which the God of the king my lord gave me. But I have smitten him. And let the king my lord know that all my brethren have abandoned me. And it is I and Abdu Heba, who is a fellow warlord, who fight against the chief of the Habiru. Now this same Abdu-Heba adds, let the king my lord send out troops of archers, for the king has no lands left. The Habiru plunder all the lands of the king. If there are archers here in this year, the lands of the king, O my lord, will remain intact. But if there are no archers here, the lands of the king my lord will be lost. He then adds a rather poignant question. Shall we do like Lob-Ehu, the Canaanite prince responsible for Shechem, who gave the land of Shechem to the Habiru? Now I know of no other invasion of this land to which these reports might refer. It seems to me a logical conclusion that the Amarna letters, all the information that we have here, is indeed talking about the invasion of the Hebrews, the children of Israel, into this promised land. Now, as they come into the land, they divide up the land according to their tribes. If you look at the map carefully, you'll notice that different tribes have smaller or larger portions of land, and that's determined by their population. Interestingly, as we see in the book of Numbers, the census taken at the beginning of the book, when the children of Israel had just come out of Egypt, and the census taken at the end of the book as they're getting ready to enter the land a generation later, was very close. It's approximately the same number of people. And the tribes that were the largest got the largest area of land. So you see that Judah has a very large area. Simeon is small enough that it's really contained within Judah. If you look at the tribe of Manasseh, you'll see that Manasseh is a very large tribe, very populous, even though it is only half of an original tribe, being a son of Joseph. Joseph's portion is divided between Manasseh and Ephraim, and they both grew very much. And of course, the tribe then that those two replaced were what would have been Joseph, and then the tribe of Levi, who received no land because the tribe of Levi were to be those that took care of the tabernacle, later the temple. And their occupation was to be in serving the Lord. Well, that is the way that the land looked and some of what took place. Now, when you go into a land, or even before, when you've got a group of people, you've got to have a government. And the children of Israel did have government. Let's look at that briefly before we look further into what occurred as they came in. In the book of Judges and Ruth, we have an account of what took place after the conquering of as much land as they did conquer. But they had government set up by God. If I were to ask you to name the three branches of government, what would you say? Do you remember your high school or maybe even junior high government class? Do you remember them? Well, there's the legislative branch, which in the United States is fulfilled by Congress. And then there's the executive branch, which is accomplished by the presidency. And what's the last one? Yes, the judicial branch, which is realized by our Supreme Court. I knew you would get it. Any government must somehow embody these branches. The same was true for ancient Israel, too. Even though it was a theocracy that is ruled by God, a government by God, they still had these three branches represented. And as Israel moved into the promised land, this is how the government was designed to function. There's the theocracy, which is the authority of Yahweh as king. And then we have the legislative branch over on the left. Now, the legislative branch makes laws, but of course God had already given them the law. That covenant was fixed, but it was designed to be taught by the Levites. So they had to be people had to be taught the law. And in this covenant, the conditions of Yahweh's blessings were defined, as well as the conditions of cursings. Then we move to the executive branch. Well, who functions as the executive here? Yahweh does. Yahweh, as king, is the executive. And as a part of his executing judgment, rule over the people, he uses foreign nations as an executive of curse, and he uses the judge as a military leader as an executive of blessing. And then we come to the judicial branch. Here we have the judge as a vice-regent. The judge is there to justify, that is, to declare within rights. See, that's what a judge does. He justifies someone, that is, declares them to be within their rights or not guilty of a crime. And that's how the judges of Israel were functioning. They were there to justify, but also, on the negative side, to condemn. A judge condemns those that are guilty, and the judge for Israel would declare guilt on the people of God and call for their repentance because their guilt was against God. And so we see that the judge in Israel in Deuteronomy 16:18 was not just one judge over the nation. We might think of it that way because if you're familiar with the book of Judges, you know that there are different judges at different times. But in reality, judges were to be appointed in every town. They were to function as the local magistrate who would declare that the people were acting according to God's law or that they were not and were to be therefore condemned. So, the book of Judges is not just people coming into a position that God was using to bring peace to them, and we'll talk about that more next time as we get into the book of Judges. But it was somebody that was there all the time. It was someone that the people could go to. If you remember back when Moses was leading the people of Israel, had led them out of Egypt, and there were so many people with so many problems that were coming to Moses that both Moses' father-in-law Jethro and Yahweh himself told Moses that he needed to appoint those people beneath him, those people that could help him to bring judgment to the people so that Moses' days were not entirely consumed by all of these problems that the people were bringing. There were judges appointed to do that. And God continues that. Yahweh continues that system as they come into the promised land. Now, however, they're going to be scattered over a wide area as these tribes are embracing the land that is being given to them, that they're fighting for and driving people out of, but the land that God had given to them. And so now judges need to be scattered throughout the land as well. Judges need to be in the various towns and villages of the entire land, scattered so that people have easy access to a judge in order to address the difficulties that they may be having, maybe the legal difficulties that they're encountering. And certainly the judge is there to point out adherence to or disobedience of God's law. So I hope that gives you some good background for the judges as we're coming up. I also hope that you have gained from what we've looked at concerning Jericho. It's one of those events that people mock sometimes as not being realistic, as not having happened. But as we saw today, there's a lot of archaeological evidence that fits exactly what happened when Joshua fit the battle of Jericho and the walls came tumbling down. Well, next time we're going to look more at the people that are around the land of Canaan that Israel has to deal with, and also what happens during the period of the Judges that we find in the biblical book of Judges and Ruth. That's next time on Discovering His Story.
What's the real story? How did all of this come to be? Was it all by chance, or did something or someone design everything? Join us as we learn from our host, William Henry, and discover that the story of the earth and our universe is really his story.